But
Mm-hmm.
when you converge business outcomes, when you
Mm-hmm.
think practically from that perspective, behavior science is key, as we know it is in marketing. So let's start to think ahead a bit, right? So like the season one, learn a ton, have amazing folks that are a part of this movement with us,
Mm-hmm.
right? They're scratching their heads saying, "What's next? How do we do this?" Right? So how do we do this? And I think season two, and it will be similar to season one, where every episode is a question, because we're looking to go beyond. We're
Mm-hmm.
looking to push the envelope to figure out what's next, and how do we meet the pressure of the consumerization, right, of the employee experience? One of the questions, but the one that I think be fun to start with. I want to hear your view. We're still in the question of what functional area are we going to work with.
Yeah.
Who is the champion of this? And this is where we began today's conversation, which was kind of the ocean moment where we
Yeah.
thought about one function. But let's talk about each one for a minute.
Yeah.
Who are the likely suspects, and what are maybe a little bit of the benefits, right, of each one, and where did we arrive to that gave us a pause?
Yeah. Well, since I'm not a functional person, a technical person, I can't go super deep on this, right? So there are some usual suspects that live in HR and L&D area. Again, that's out of my depth. But what we have found is, if you talk to companies like Accenture, PwCs, and say, "Hey, we have an exciting offering for HR," they're probably not going to be super excited. Or L&D, right? So traditionally, these are the functions where budgets are small. And think about it. Like, if your budgets are small, what does that mean? Right? Like, what's the perception of value for that, right? So, like, when somebody says, "Well, we don't have a lot of budget," or "It's hard for us to find budget," blah blah. What does that really mean, right? So, I've been on the services side trying to sell to those lines of businesses, and it's the fact that the budgets are not there is a red flag. I don't have the expertise, and my amygdala is not strong enough to come up with answers, but clearly there's an issue there, right? Then we talk about, well, maybe it's IT. We talked about data. We talk about platforms, and we've talked about to some C-level IT leaders. But ITs are not really attached to outcomes. Nor, if you've been in a services world, and even technology world, IT usually are, these are the blockers, right? A lot of time, the very organization that's supposed to drive innovation is the organization that chokes down the innovation, because there's nothing in it for them. If it goes well, business realizes all the benefits. If it doesn't go well, IT is on the hook because they didn't implement it correctly.
It may be in some cases, and in other cases, I'll just say they're really busy. They have a lot going on. They're meeting the demands of the virtual potentially.
Yeah.
There's digital transformation taking place across all aspects of the organization.
Yeah.
And I think what you said before, like, where do you focus?
Yeah.
Where do you focus your attention? Well, if business outcomes are important, which they are in an organization, you focus on those areas that can enable for you to meet those business outcomes. And this ain't one of them. Historically, up until now, hasn't been one of them.
Yeah. Agreed. Then you have PMO, right? So a lot of people are like, well, obviously it's PMO, right? Because it's the same idea. You have people initiatives. We already have, tens of people. We have all the systems, project management systems, all that stuff. Then you ask them, okay, well, if you have all this robust PMO, why is your efficiency and effectiveness of your initiatives is not all that great, right? And that is because PMO is an oversight organization, right? They're not really concerned about with business outcomes, right? So it's a governance oversight organization, making sure that the process is followed, right? It's like inspectors who come in and do your home inspections. They don't really care if you like living in your house, right? They're just making sure that if something were to happen, they've blessed it, and here's the process, and you follow the process, and they're in good shape. Then who else do you have? We talked about L&D again. I can't talk much about them. Yeah, change management is an interesting one. So I think you have innovation, right? I think innovation is going to be an important partner, right? Because at least these are the people with an open mind and people who are, because they constantly have to think about business outcomes, right? Because no company wants to innovate just for the sake of it, for the heck of it. So so people in change management are very much in a cross side, right? So they're definitely something that needs to be looked at. The problem is, again, they're not, they care about business outcomes in principle, but they're not actually associated with the actual outcomes.
They haven't been provided with the infrastructure,
Yeah.
with the ability to have the correlation.
Yeah.
with
And then change management is an interesting one. I think so that leaves us with operations, right? And at the end of the day, I mean, if you roll up sales and operations, or basically whatever these are the people who find a way to make things work, right? So when IT is not giving them the tools that they need, they spend the weekend and build something in Excel, right? So if I were to run my company, I'd be looking at those folks, because these people who that's their world, business outcomes, right? So if you live in operations, if you're talking to customers, you have the chops, you have the understanding, you have the discipline, you have the mentality of making sure that everything you do results in a business outcome. And the other that's interesting is marketing.
Let me introduce that one too.
Yeah.
Let me just hear myself rationalize through that as well, because it brings back, as I was a contributor for Inc. and hundreds of interviews, the co-author of a book, Science of Story, and our thesis, right, in that book, and a lot of it was where do stories come from? How do the chief storytellers, look at it as chief marketing officers, how do they communicate? And we said brand is a reflection of culture. There was actually a quote by one of the Kellogg executives, but I like that when a couple of days ago you were like, brand is a reflection of culture. I see it differently.
Yeah.
How do you see it before I kind of jump back into the rest of this?
Well, I was taught, and I agree with that brand is a promise, right? So when you think about Volvo, the brand stands for safety. When you talk about BMW, the promise is, what is it? Performance machine, ultimate performance machine, right? You think about Toyota, you think about reliability, right? So I don't really know whether the culture of Volvo versus General Motors versus Toyota versus Mercedes are any different, right? So to me, brand is about what promise do I make to the consumer, and then doing everything I do that's consumer facing to reinforce that promise and not breaking that promise.
And this is the interesting piece, because now we're looking at the people-related challenges reaching a boiling point. And I think that as they scratch their head and they say, okay, if brand is a reflection of its promise, just for a second, kind of taking that theme, you then ask, how does the customer experience that promise?
Yeah.
Well, they experience it through the employees of the organization. And if the employees of the organizations are, don't experience the culture, I think is a bit of a all-encompassing catchword. But if they don't experience the culture that helps them activate their behaviors in order for them to be able to deliver the promise to the customers, then the organization fails, because brand isn't a reflection of culture. But it's not here or there, because we're in the same zip codes.
Yeah.
Where I want to go next is, or where my mind went next, is to say, okay, when we launched years ago, ProHabits was this idea that when you have a purpose and values and leadership behaviors, and when you're trying to create a culture, you create a lot of these moments, right? Moments, the executives, keynotes, speakers come in. We worked with Simon Sinek, Jennifer Brown, lots of speakers over the years.
Yeah.
And we asked the question of what happens the day after, right? What happens the day after these inspiring events? And again, as a co-founder of an agency, I left that thinking aside. I wasn't converging the thoughts. I just stayed with what happens the day after these moments. But recently, in conclusion of the season, thinking about consumerization, I began to ask the question of, what's the role of the CMO for internal audiences? Or in other words, when they think about their world of being a storyteller, is it as simple as saying, let's add a new audience, right? The audience externally, there are audiences. It's not one audience. There are current customers, past customers. They're divided into segments, locations, and so on. Why don't you think about a new audience? And then you said, well, marketing isn't business outcomes, right? They are also in the world of a bit of the leading indicators,
Mm-hmm.
right? Remind me kind of how you wanted the positioning that marketing is also one step removed from the outcome.
Yeah. Well, we talked about how marketing had to change to be more outcome driven, to be able to demonstrate their effectiveness based on sales number instead of the leading indicators. But then at the end of the day, if you talk to marketing executives and marketing functions, they don't sell, right? So even though they'll go in and do their MMM model and they say we need to do this and spend more money on TV here and more of this there and blah blah blah, at the end of the day, they don't control the sales process. Completely different function. So they also have plausible deniability and say, hey, we did what we're supposed to be doing, but salespeople screwed it up, or something else happened, right? So, but what's interesting is, because we talked about who in an organization has the mindset and would be able to actually run a program like this, and it makes sense that it's a marketer, right? Because they understand the data part, they understand the behavior part, they understand the engagement part. Like, they live in this world. The digital marketing people have lived in this for 20 years. What's missing is the business outcome ownership, right? And I was thinking about how 20, 30 years ago Microsoft Excel came in, right? So Excel comes in, the tool comes in, you have a bunch of people who do all the finance on a piece of paper, and now they need an Excel. Well, they can't run Excel. They need to install Excel. They need to apply service packs, right? So IT then becomes an enabler, right? So IT they know how to use Excel. They know how to install Excel. They know everything there is about Excel. They just don't know how to use Excel to create an income statement, right? Similar with marketing, right? Marketing has understanding of the technology. They have all of the qualifications to do this. They just don't know how to improve turnover because they don't understand the business side of it. So similar to how IT became an enabler of finance, right? And now, if you look at finance, you have ERP system, you have all the systems. IT is integral part of finance. IT is integral part of sales. IT is integral part of PMO, right? Now we have maybe potentially marketing is an enabler of people initiatives, right? Is there a room to rethink about role of marketing organization instead of saying marketing is a 100% external function, marketing only services the consumers, right? Is there a room to say, hey, if we have these people with this amazing skill sets who gets the data, who get the behavior science, and who understand the levers, and who understand the channel and the engagement side and the operations side, right? Because they run campaigns, they pivot often, they do the A/B testing, they do all the things that are necessary to impact your intended audience, right? They have the know-how. So I don't know if they're able to drive those processes, those initiatives, but they potentially there is a room for them to become an enabler, right? So in this new world, whoever owns the outcome, that extended team has the IT resource and a marketing resource, right? And I think of a skill set, not necessarily organizationally, but that sort of skill set on the team, right?
It's kind of like, currently they look at the whatever product or service the company offers. They look at the operational folks and they talk about what are we releasing, what is our roadmap if it's a product or services, how are we different, how are we positioning? So they rely on them, and those are the people that then deliver on the promise. So the question now is, will they look at the CHRO and say, okay, what are the business outcomes? How are we thinking about these audience? What are we trying to accomplish?
I think in season 2, there's an opportunity to really explore this, whether companies leave a lot on the table by not tapping into the wealth of potential value sitting in their marketing organization. and figuring out how to put that to work, not only externally but also internally. And I think as we explore this, I think there's going to be a lot of aha and gotchas and a lot of aha moments on figuring out how to use this existing resource instead of building out a completely new set of skill sets and completely new set of organizational departments. The question is, do you already have all the pieces in place, right? Maybe there is a little bit of rewiring that needs to happen, mind change needs to happen, because every time you're trying to do something that requires, like I can't go and practice law. Like it's a skill set that takes years. It's not just knowledge. I can read all the law books, right? But it's a skill set that takes years to hone.
It's a capability also, not of one person, but lots of people
Exactly.
who writes content, who does the images.
Exactly.
But most importantly, you start at the strategic level. Who's going to create the roadmap for us? And about the same, about a week prior to you and I having that discussion, one of the guests sent me a link to an article that talked about Linda Buff, the CMO of GE. I actually had the opportunity to interview her about 6 or 7 years ago for Inc. And she took on the role of also being the vice president of learning and culture, right? In addition to being the CMO. And this is a little excerpt that I think is super beneficial. As the vice president of learning and culture, Buff will lead learning and development for the company's 300,000 employees worldwide. She also will assume responsibility for actually that's not as relevant. So my point is, there is already signals that are starting to emerge that marketing can play a critical role in the people initiatives.
But I think the challenge is that the rest of the enterprise does not understand what those guys do and where else they can help out. So we're seeing strong relationship marketing in IT, strong relationship marketing in sales, and that's it. So I think there is a huge opportunities for companies, right, in terms of the skill set. So we have to figure out, hopefully in season 2 we'll get closer as to who should own it, right? So we rattled off a couple of Atlanta businesses. Me being the CEO roles and running organizations, I'd be more comfortable if ops owned it, because at the end of the day, ops has to deliver something every day, right? They can't survive activity based. We talked about that. Ops is all outcome based, right? So I'd feel more comfortable that it will get done if it sits in ops. But I'm not a thought leader in the space. Would be interesting to see. And number 2 is, once we figure out who owns it and who drives it, what that ideal makeup of the team is. So we talked about cross-functional. That seems to be table stakes at this point. That's been validated through God knows how many conversations. So the idea that we need the data cross-functional across multiple phases and multiple steps of the employee experience, that makes perfect sense. But then where does marketing come in?
And let's remember the 4 pillars of people initiatives, right? If we're moving toward a world where its success is measured by business outcomes, right? Marketing, check. Like they understand how to become at least the leading indicator to that.
Exactly.
The decisions are data driven, check. Like marketing folks are data driven to the core. Communication is hyper personalized. Who knows more about personalization or meeting the pressure of consumerization than them? And the last, thinking about the employee journey with deliberate care.
Yeah.
Right, as they do with customer journey, and they have that understanding.
Exactly.
So now when we look at moving away from the 4 pillars to the 3 enablers, and we say, okay, understanding the data, having the behavior science, the last is the platform, and I think there's the selfless plug that we're trying desperately to figure out what that future brings, so that we can meet them in time to offer them the platform that is going to be able to accomplish what we see as the future of people initiatives. Where I'm also curious in season 2, could we find some organizations? So we know they're champions, right? Okay, cool. We're meeting them, and we've met some of them, and thank God there's so many of them. That this isn't just going to be one person per every 100 companies. There's probably a number of champions in every organization that sees that it's time to start to manifest something new. But now, how can we get them to mobilize the stakeholders that are cross-functional bring them together and ask some of these questions. Very
Mhm.
pointed questions. How do we meet the pressure to consumerize the employee experience? How do we move toward those 4 pillars of Future People initiatives?
Mhm.
And then come back with, this is what happened, right? Because all the most progressive are asking these questions today. That is the sign of being progressive.
Mhm.
It's going to be fun to find out
Yeah.
where this goes. Season
Yeah.
2.
Looking
Goddamn.
forward to it.
What didn't like that? That's our discussion Saturday, right? Did we capture it all? I mean, what does that conversation look like when they bring together the stakeholders?